One of my favorite things about the fantasy genre is the idea of the journey, stepping out into the wider world and heading out on an adventure. The journey is both an internal and external one. Characters often change as they experience the world and adversity around them, but the physical world also changes as the characters continue along their adventures. And what I love about fantasy is all of the fantastical and awe-inspiring natural world that the characters encounter along their quests. The Lord of the Rings, one of the classics of fantasy, captures the journey and the physical world so well. The hobbits leave the Shire to head off into the bigger world. They travel through woods, down rivers, into dark undergrounds, and beyond as they try to accomplish their quest by casting the One Ring into the fires of Mount Doom. The natural world is so present in The Lord of the Rings, it invokes and embodies the grand sense of adventure to me. That is why geography and the natural world is an important feature in developing your fantasy RPG sandbox. If you want to give the players those enticing exploration opportunities, you need to present a rich and deep world that physically changes around them as they head out and embark on quests of their own. Hi. Welcome to Earthmote. I'm Randall. Today we are talking about all things geography and how to use it in our RPG sandbox games. So let's go ahead and get into it. When I'm talking about geography and sandboxes in this video, I'm going to be taking a regional focus. By regional, I mean a map that is probably big enough to hold a couple of kingdoms, but not necessarily an entire continent. I think it's important to start kind of small when you're building your sandbox. There's no need to build out a ton of stuff when you're just getting started. One, it'll take way too long. And two, you don't know if you're going to use it yet. So just save yourself the trouble and start with something regional. In my latest map that I'm using to build my new sandbox, my map is approximately 80 miles by 80 miles in size, which would be the size of one of the smallest states in the United States, or the size of Montenegro if you're more familiar with European countries. So in a map of that size, we aren't likely to have significant variation in the region. For example, you probably won't have glaciers in the same area as a vast desert of scorching sands. But you can have some variation, and that's what we're going to talk about here. For a regional map, Kevin Crawford, author of Worlds Without Number, talks in the book about how you probably want 6 major geographic features within the region. And I think that's about right. Looking at my own map, I'm pretty close to that number. Multiple features are great because it introduces biodiversity within your sandbox, and different biomes let your players experience different types of play and different types of atmosphere. Mountains are tempestuous and challenging. Forests are dense and foreboding. Plains can be sprawling and exposed. Deserts are unyielding and hostile. And rivers can be both a barrier or a highway. Geography has influences on our games. It impacts the choices your players can make, and it impacts the sort of subtle context of your world. When I think about geography and the influence that it has on our sandbox campaign design, I like to think of it in 2 different categories. One that I call Fluff Worldbuilding and one that I call Gameable Worldbuilding. When I'm talking about gameable world building, I mean that we have a set of elements that can directly impact how your world is presented to the players in-game in a meaningful way. For example, if you have a mountainous region in your sandbox, then monsters that are specific to mountains can appear there. That is sort of a tangible impact on your game. Whereas if you have no snowy climates in your sandbox, then you probably won't have many Yetis making appearances in your game. Geography can also have serious impact on how the players are going to navigate the sandbox world. It can present barriers to the player's travel, and they may have to choose between different routes to get to the location of their choice. Those different geographical routes can present different challenges to the party, and that is good geographical design within your sandbox. Here are several different gameable items that I think are impacted by your geographic choices when you're making your sandbox. Creature and monster selection, which monsters are available in which different biomes, physical access, barriers to nearby locations, trade routes and roads. Those will generally follow paths of least resistance. Select types of adventuring locations. These might only be available in different areas. For example, if you want an underwater temple, well, there needs to be large bodies of water to have a temple present. Settlements are going to naturally reside in specific areas, ones that are close to bodies of water and ones that are close to resources that the settlement can utilize to build and grow. Weather, of course, will be impacted by your geographical choices and different geocentric subsystems. I talked a little bit about it in an earlier video, but if you have sort of an island sandbox, then you're probably going to want some sort of navigation or wind component subsystems, so your players, when they set sail, have different impacts on how they travel through the regions. Fluff world building is exactly what it sounds like. There are things that impact the design of your sandbox campaign, but they probably don't have a strong effect on the outcome of your game. For example, geography will impact the types of crops and livestock that are grown and raised within the region, but the physical foods mean very little to your game. They don't have a real effect on it. Fluff world building can shape the societies and customs in your sandbox. They can help explain why things are the way they are, but they won't likely have a big impact on your players' dungeon delves unless those customs or societies are present within the dungeon itself. Fluff world building is definitely secondary world building. I would not spend too much of your time developing this when you're first building out your sandbox. It is nice to have in the back of your mind as you're thinking about different design aspects of your sandbox, but don't flesh it out in detail at all unless you really need it. Here are several different fluff items that I think are impacted by geographic choices to be aware of. Food and livestock types, trade goods, building materials, and population densities. When it comes to building your map and the geographical features that will dominate it, there are two ways you can kind of go about it. You can focus a lot on an Earth-like model and follow the similar geographic formations that you see on Earth. Rivers flow downhill, they rarely split. Most river tributaries will collect into a single large river that dumps into the sea or the ocean. Geography generally gradually changes, something like plains to hills to mountains, rather than sudden cuts. You don't see swamplands next to deserts. If you like realism, I'd check out Asgar's mapping tool. It can spit out different maps for you, and then you can just rip them wholesale for your use. And even if you don't like that, you can just study the maps to look at the biomes that it presents next to one another, and the mountain formations and the waterways and how they all kind of mesh into one another, and build your own map using kind of that as a reference. I'll include a link in the description to check it out. It's free and it's awesome. Your second option is really to kind of hand wave all of that. If your players don't care that much about the geography, then it probably doesn't matter that much. Put things on the map that are interesting to you and will support you in building the type of sandbox you want your players to experience. In a fantasy world, you can always use magic to explain away any natural inconsistencies with our Earth-like model. Speaking of magic, we are playing a fantasy role-playing game, so you can and should definitely use magical phenomena in your geography. Things like giant glowing mushroom forests, or swamps permeating with purple fog, or perhaps a floating Earthmote, maybe with a castle on top. Magic in our geography is a great way to capture the player's imagination. It's a way to make them stop and think, Whoa, what are we seeing here? We've entered into this domain where Earth like laws don't necessarily apply. So, how do we go about navigating this strange land that we now find ourselves in? If you're introducing magical geography into your game, you'll definitely want to give it some sort of game mechanics. Make it so it benefits or hinders the players. I'm a big fan of neutral effects that the players can use to their advantage if they get clever about it. Perhaps they enter into an area with lower gravity. Well, that means they can jump farther or even float up to locations that might otherwise have been unreachable to them. I'd still recommend magical geography be more like the toppings you put on top of your ice cream sundae rather than the ice cream itself. Less is more. When everything is magical, then nothing really is, and the novelty will wear thin pretty quickly. Geography is a vital piece of your sandbox building. It will dictate a lot of decisions for the rest of your game setup, and it will present the world to your players in a very specific way. There's technically no wrong way to go about building your geography. You can use the realistic Earth-like approach, or you can just hand wave it and go with elements that you think are good. Let me know in the comments below. Do you like to plan out your maps and geography in detail, or do you just go with what feels right? If you like this video, consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps me out a lot. We'll be covering more sandbox topics in the future, so you can check those out. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.